We're going to run through and talk about some things today from the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. But before we do that, any questions that you guys have that I can answer first? All right, I'll take that as a no. Okay, so let me share my screen here. We're going to pull up the exclusive right to sell here. So what I want to do is go through, there's been quite a few questions that have come up over the last couple of weeks and regarding the broker compensation from our exclusive right to sell listing agreement. And so what I thought it might be helpful to do is to just run through that as a reminder of how all of that works and just make sure everybody knows how to correctly fill it out so that we make sure we're getting paid and that we know how we're paying to other people. And as you have questions along the way, go ahead and stop me and we will talk about it. So first section here, section 2.1. So this section here is how much the seller is going to pay to our brokerage. And so, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, although we may read a lot of it, but it says if during the listing period, the company, the seller's agent, the seller, another real estate agent, or anyone else locates a party who is ready, willing, and able to buy, lease, or exchange the property or any part thereof at the listing price and terms on the data form or the price and terms which the seller agrees to in writing, the seller has negotiated with and agrees to pay the company a brokerage fee in the amount of blank percent and a dollar sign here of the acquisition price. So on this, obviously, you're going to put in just how much you are expecting to get paid from the seller. So if you remember from the old exclusive right to sell, we were collecting the total, including what would be paid to a buyer's agent. Now in this section, this is just how much are you going to get paid? And I always just want to point out, notice this is an and, not an or on here. So in our case, a lot of times what will happen is we will put in there 3% and 295 or 3% and 495 or 3.5 and 595. So anyway, whatever you're going to be charging to the seller is going to go in there. This new section, and I say new meaning in the last couple of months, but is the seller's brokerage fee with an unrepresented buyer. So this section now is going through and just saying if a buyer is not represented by a brokerage, so that would even include our brokerage. So it's just anybody, if a buyer shows up saying, hey, I want to buy the home and I don't want to be represented by an agent because I don't want to have to pay a commission, then what this section is explaining to the seller is that if the buyer is not represented, the seller and the company agree that the company is going to have additional liability and responsibilities in the transaction. So therefore, the seller is going to agree to pay an additional percentage and dollar amount of the gross acquisition price, and that will be added to section 2.1. So this section here would be you to have a discussion with the seller of saying, okay, in the event somebody shows up and is wanting to buy your house and they don't want to be represented, this gives you the opportunity to explain to your seller that there's still going to be additional liability and responsibilities in the transaction. In fact, I would say the liability in the transaction probably goes up if they're not being represented by another agent, and therefore we should be entitled to being compensated for taking on that additional liability. And then the additional responsibilities are going to be that you're going to end up doing some things on to help out that buyer. So not representing, but to help out the buyer throughout the transaction. And so as a result of that, we're telling the seller, if that happens, then we need to be compensated some additional money. And how much you put in there is going to be up to you of, do you want to say, I personally would say probably ought to be at least 1% you ought to put in there, but you may work it out with the seller that you say it'll be an additional 3%. So just some additional amount of money that you would be paid in the event they're not represented by another brokerage. Okay. Any questions on that one before I go on to the section 2.3? Okay, good. Or you guys just can't hear me at all. Either way. I'm sure you can, or somebody would have said something by now. So, section 2.3, authorization to offer compensation to the buyer's brokerage. So now on this one is one where people still seem to be a little bit confused on. So let's kind of run through that. So this one saying is that we are authorized to advertise or otherwise communicate. So the key words in this section is to advertise or otherwise communicate. So this is the seller now giving us authorization to advertise or communicate that they are willing to pay a compensation to a buyer's brokerage. And then it's saying in the amount of, and now notice on this one, the difference on this one is this one's saying an amount up to a certain percentage or a dollar amount. So keep in mind on this one, we changed from these two as being ands. So you're going to get that the percentage and a flat amount to this one here being a percentage or a certain amount of the gross acquisition price. So just keep that in mind. This one is an or. So if you put a dollar amount in both sections, what I have seen is that people say, oh, well, we're going to choose, and I'll give you a quick example of that is we had somebody that put on one of these something that was 3% or 295, thinking that it was an and and so in that scenario, a seller could come back and make an argument of saying, oh, well, I'm choosing the 295 because it was or I could do 3% or a 295. Now, in the scenario that I saw that in, we were actually on the side of the transaction where it benefited us, but and it was a scenario where the other agent came and said the seller can choose between these two options. And so our agent said, oh, we're going to choose the lower one, which the intention was for it to be like $3,000. And it ended up that it would have been like $100 and something. And so we didn't end up doing that, by the way. But just that's the idea of keep in mind, or says it's this or that. So, okay. So next piece of this, if no amount is entered, then what that's saying is that we are not authorized to advertise or communicate that the seller is willing to pay anything. So again, that doesn't mean the seller can't offer to pay something or excuse me, can't end up paying something. It's just saying we are not allowed to advertise. So if an agent called you and said, hey, is your seller willing to pay anything towards my brokerage fee, you would not be authorized to give them any answer. Really, you just have to say, I'm not authorized to tell you what the seller would do. So think of it that way, is this section really is giving you permission. If an agent were to call and say, hey, would your seller do it, you can say, yeah, this is what they're willing to do, is up to a certain amount. Now, you may not want to say the exact amount. You may want to turn that around to your client's best interest and say, well, how much are you looking for, rather than just right out telling him, because it could save your client some money. So next piece says, unless checked below, the company may enter into a written compensation agreement to pay a buyer's brokerage not to exceed the authorized amount in 2.3. So this section is saying whatever amount is in here, we would now be authorized to enter into a compensation agreement. So you don't have to even go back and ask the seller if they were to ask you for our brokerage to pay their brokerage. Now, we really haven't seen this. And if you go back, those of you that are on here that have been with us long enough, when we first started talking about this, uh, I said I really didn't think we would use that broker compensation agreement very often. And from what I've seen so far, that is correct, was we are not seeing the broker compensation agreement very often. In fact, I will tell you the time that the only the couple times that I have seen the compensation agreement being used, it's being used improperly. And one time would have been to our benefit, the other time would have been to our detriment. But the agents were putting the commission on the repsy and sending over the broker compensation agreement, which would essentially mean the commission would be being paying twice, once by the brokerage and once by the seller. So that's all this section is saying, is that if we have an amount in here, we could automatically sign that and obligate then the seller to paying this additional amount of commission to us, to which we would then share with the other brokerage. So this section then, or the next piece, just says if the company agrees to a written compensation agreement to pay the buyer's brokerage, then the seller agrees that the brokerage fee will be increased by the amount agreed in the compensation agreement. So again, that would be saying we're going to take whatever amount is on that compensation agreement and add it to whatever the seller's already agreed to pay us, and then we are paying the other brokerage. So really that scenario of using the broker compensation agreement takes us back in time to us just paying out to whoever, that BAC. And so anyway, any questions on that section? Or did I either really explained it really well or I confused you like crazy? So any questions? If no questions, I'm going to take it as I did really good, or you're really confused. Okay, next.
So
the next,
can I just,
yep.
Of course, going on the NAR settlement, you can advertise anywhere, but the MLS, you can't touch that, obviously. But is that true?
Yes, so we can advertise it, and the only exception to what you said is we cannot advertise it anywhere in the MLS or anything linked to the MLS.
Anything linked. Okay.
Yep.
Great.
If it's something linked to the MLS, you could not do it there either. But you could put it on your for sale sign. You could put a note in the house. You could text the agents when they request a showing. You could advertise it any place like that. So
okay.
Yep. Andy said including aligned, right, and that is correct. You cannot advertise it in aligned showing because that is connected. So anyway, okay, perfect. The next piece on this, where it was saying it unless initialed below. So down here, it's saying seller does not authorize the company to enter into a written compensation agreement with the buyer's brokerage. So in that section, basically, if they are initialing this, the seller is just saying we are not allowed to enter into that compensation agreement. So hopefully that makes sense. So you would have to go back and get permission from the seller if that was the process. But again, like I said, it's pretty rare that we end up doing that, so that shouldn't be too much of an issue.
So that also covers limited agency, doesn't it?
Limited agency would, well, when you say that covers
the seller does not authorize the company to enter within a written compensation agreement with the buyer's broker. That means we couldn't even do designated agency, don't you think?
No, I don't think that's what that means. It's just saying that we are not authorized to just go and sign that compensation agreement. So really, I guess the way you could look at it is they may put an amount up here that we would be authorized to say the seller will contribute towards the buyer's brokerage. If they don't initial this, we could automatically just go sign that compensation agreement and obligate the brokerage to paying it, but the seller to saying, yes, you're good to go ahead and do that without it. If they've initialed this, it could mean, yes, you're authorized to advertise it, but we aren't authorized just to enter into a written compensation agreement without permission.
So your argument is saying that that's within 2.3. It's not just a standard legal statement, because if that was a standard legal statement, it would include limited or designated agency. So the argument is that it's part of 2.3, right?
I still would say no, because this section right here would have nothing to do with limited agency, because we wouldn't enter into a compensation agreement in a limited agency scenario. So in the limited agency scenario, that would tie back to those still up here of if we had put in the additional 3% of saying that they would be willing to pay it. So we would have to, what the best way to probably answer it is in the limited agency scenario, the buyer is going to owe you based on your buyer broker. And then the best scenario is just ask within the REPC for the seller to pay that on behalf of the buyer. So they still could do it. And this really would have nothing to do with limited agency, because in a limited agency scenario, we wouldn't sign a broker compensation agreement.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Somebody else, I think, had it. Yeah.
This is Joanna, and I ever had my clients initial that section feeling that it was indicating that the seller is not going to pay a buyer broker commission. But are you saying it just means we're not authorized to let anyone know what the commission is?
So no, this, if they initial down here, it's just saying that we are not authorized to enter the written compensation agreement with the buyer's brokerage. You could still advertise it. We just can't automatically just sign it. We would have to go back to the seller to do the compensation agreement.
What is a scenario where we would sign a written compensation agreement without the seller's signature or without them knowing about it?
Yeah, if they don't initial here, then we are authorized to go ahead and sign it and obligate them to whatever the amount is up to. So keywords up to whatever the amount is up here in the compensation agreement. So
So,
think of it as they're giving us permission to, yeah, go ahead and obligate me to up to whatever the amount is here
okay,
in a
gotcha.
compensation
And
agreement.
that would really only happen if they send over the buyer broker compensation agreement, right? Not if they're
Correct.
asking for it in the rep C.
Correct.
Okay, gotcha. Now I'm with you.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Yep. You're welcome.
Russ,
Yes.
I'm confused. So if you leave 2.3 blank and then don't check the box, doesn't that like contradict both?
Was a good question. So yeah, on that, if no amount is entered, so if we left that blank, then we are not authorized to, I would say you're not authorized, you're not authorized to communicate that the seller would pay any type of a brokerage fee. And you're also not authorized to sign the compensation agreement. So if this is blank, basically this whole section is void. And I don't know that void's the right word, but null. Does that make sense, Stephanie?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I don't
Okay, and then,
usually,
sorry, go ahead, Tracy.
I don't usually like to leave blank spaces. Is there something we can put in there or you would prefer us to?
I would say if you put NA, that would count because this says if no amount is entered. So if you put an NA, that is not an amount.
Thanks.
So that's what I'd say as opposed to leaving it blank. Yep. Okay, section 2.4. So this section is explaining how it's payable. Says the brokerage fee, unless otherwise agreed in writing by the seller and the company, shall be due and payable from the seller's proceeds on if it's a purchase, the recording, if it's a lease, the effective date of the lease, if it's an option, the date the consideration for the option agreement is paid. So again, on a lease option, this is saying they would owe us as soon as they agree to and accept the lease option. And then there was a couple things in here that I thought would be good to note. So if within the listing period or any extension of the listing period, the property is withdrawn from sale, transferred, conveyed, leased, rented, or made unmarketable by a voluntary act of the seller without the written consent of the company, or if the sale is prevented by a default of the seller, the brokerage fee shall immediately be due and payable to the company. So if for some reason the seller were to make the property unmarketable, they did something to try to sabotage selling the property, this section is saying they would owe us the commission at that point. Okay. And then the last part is just that the brokerage fees, this is part of the settlement agreement, is that brokerage fees are fully negotiable. Oops, I can't get it to highlight very well. Anyway, brokerage fees are fully negotiable and are not set by law, any board, association. All of this is kind of to deal with antitrust things so that we can't be blamed for colluding and things like that. So anyway, any other questions?
Hey, Russ,
Yes.
I was just going to ask you earlier about advertising because like our personal websites are linked. We have an IDS linked to the MLS, but if we want to use our personal websites to advertise compensation, is that still, we can't do that either?
And I believe actually that you could advertise, like if you had your own personal website, I believe you still can advertise. I'm like, yes, you can advertise on your personal website.
You
It
can
just
start
can't
the thing,
feed
yeah,
into it
and-
from the MLS.